So I don't want to get too much into the history of organizational development. Most of this information is covered in your textbook as far as kind of the initial organizational. So Tavascos Social Technical Institute, the NTL Institute, basically kind of organizations that are really focused at creating the practices and the theory behind organizational development. I mainly want to kind of focus on the fact that it's a relatively recent development of looking at organizations not just as a bureaucratical structure, but to really incorporate the recognition that any change in an organization is going to be happening in the actual people of the organization. That the change is going to affect their attitudes, it's going to check their behaviors, it's going to impact their feelings, and that a good organizational developmental change is not going to just have an organizational outcome in objective productivity or what's being produced. It should also be helping to create a better environment that allows change to occur. It's targeting the people themselves and how they view their organization and their role within it. And the main point of history that I also want to just kind of hit on is Kurt Levin's impact in this field. He was a social psychologist, but was very interested in kind of incorporating what we know about human behavior, human perceptions, and how humans react to change in order to create theoretical models of how to allow organizations to conceptualize and model, if you will, successful change in organization. And towards the end of this module, we'll be talking about two of his major theories of organizational development. So who does OD? A good way to think about organizational development is that ideally it has three major levels. It has the actual top level of the organization that we talked about in the last module, that it is a top-down driven model. In other words, there are stakeholders, the CEO, the president, the C-suite executives, that have recognized the need for change. So they're driving it. They're driving the change. They're the ones that are making the decision, we need to change how we do things in this organization. There's then the second level, the specialists, that can be either internal or external. These are the people that are actually developing the interventions or changes. They're the ones that are going to be doing the pre-testing to figure out where's the organization currently at. Is there going to be any barriers to the process of change? How do we actually institute this change? What is that intervention going to look like? And how are we going to monitor the actual effects? And this can either be internal, and some organizations have a small to fairly large organizational development section, or it could also be external. So the organization realizes that talent is not within the organizational skill sets, and therefore they bring in an external practitioner. However, probably the most important process of organizational development is actually the people that actually do the daily work in OD. They're the ones that are going to be applying those interventions. They're the ones that are going to be restructured. They're the ones that are going to be changing the way they behave within the organization to match these interventions. These are the managers, these are the HR professionals that are actually communicating the need for the change to help to sell it to the actual employees that are doing the changes. But it's also the employees themselves. And it's important to recognize that when we talk about organizational development, one of the points I was really making in the first module was this idea of collaborative decision making to a degree and open communication. And that really is indicative of what's needed to do good OD. Because good OD is about communicating a broader vision of change from upper levels of the organization through a mid-level of the organization, the actual OD practitioners who develop a plan to implement these changes, to the actual managers and HR specialists who are the boots on the ground getting it done, to the actual employees that are doing the changes. And for that really to work well, all three of those parts need to be working in connection, and that therefore there needs to be some ownership. There needs to be some feelings of collaboration. That the reason these changes are coming, the reason that we're individuals in an organization having to make these changes, is that we understand how it's going to make the organization better, and to some degree our own role in those organizations more pleasant and successful. So OD activities can include lots of broad types. I've got 4 listed here that we're going to kind of focus on as kind of the primary pre-existing best practices in OD. And they include team leaders developing teams. So this is basically taking an organization that in the past has been highly bureaucratically structured, hierarchically structured, where you have direct reports that are reporting to a supervisor. That supervisor has a supervisor, and on up, into more of an open collaborative where you have teams of people that are working together on projects and function more as a team than an individual subordinate to some supervisor. And that's often one of the, if you will, tools in the toolkit of OD, that a lot of times one of the answers to problems organizations have is that the way to become more adaptive to a changing environment is to move away from the traditional bureaucratic structure to a more team-based structure. We'll talk about building learning organizations, and this really gets to something we're going to talk about in the next few slides, this idea of organizational culture. That a lot of organizations, our first problem with OD is actually changing the culture itself from one of a resistant culture to change to one that values change. And this is basically building up a system to where people in the organization recognize that change also involves them developing their own skills. That in order for an organization to be adaptive to external environments, that means that people within that organization, every single person, needs to also be adaptive and ready to learn and to grow as the organization needs that growth to happen. And that's creating a culture that welcomes these changes as a learning opportunity. We're going to talk about implementing total quality management. This is actually a system that is used in organizations to help the organization actually become, throughout the organization at all of its levels, focused on the question, what do our customers want and how are they reacting to our product? So when we're talking about quality, we're talking about the quality of the outputs of the organization, but we're also talking about making sure the entire organization is somewhat focused on monitoring that external environment. And finally, another way to do that is creating a boundaryless organization. This is about trying to actually break down the barriers between individuals within the organizations and the structures within and without the organization. So a boundaryless organization is an organization where often we have employees that are aware of the environment that the organization exists, and it's a part of their job to think of that. And it's not just focused on the customers, it's focused on the entire organization. So basically, again, think of open systems. Open systems is the idea that the organization is a series of inputs, throughputs, and outputs that exist in an environment through a feedback loop. Creating a boundless organization is making the entire organism or organization more aware of all of those environmental aspects. So briefly, like I said, a lot of times the first challenge we have in organizational development is actually looking at the organization's culture itself. So Kurt Levin often talked about organizational development is the process of surveys, interventions, and further surveys. In other words, pre-test, change, post-test. And the reason that he was focused on surveys is that a lot of times one of our best metrics of whether an organization needs change is the morale or the attitudes or the culture of that organization. So an organization has culture, and it's a system of shared meaning that includes the language, so how people talk within the organization, lingo that's used, dress codes, and these aren't written dress codes. These are just understandings of this is acceptable dress, this is not acceptable dress. Particular patterns of behavior, so what is the way, how do you actually address your supervisors, what are the chains of command that are acceptable, how do people move from information from one person to another. The value system, so what does the organization value, what is the bottom line of what the organization is trying to achieve. The feelings and attitudes of the people in the organization itself, interactions within the organizations, and broadly group norms. So norms are really how all this information is communicated. Rarely do you find an organization, often an organization will have a competency model or core values written somewhere. It may have a dress code, it may have lines of communication delineated, but a lot of this information is informally communicated throughout the organization by looking at the norms of how other people are normally behaving. So if you have a closed structure that is going to be resistant to change, that means that the values, the behaviors, and the norms of that organizational culture are not inducive or conducive to actual change. So many times, the very first thing we need to do in organizational development, the first intervention, is about changing the behaviors, the values, and the norms of the organization from one that is closed to change to one that is open to change. And in fact, on the previous slide, when we were talking about learning organizations, that's really the goal of that particular intervention, is changing the culture from an organization that resists change to an organization that welcomes it. So just some more on these norms. There's two types of norm. Pivotal norms are essential to the accomplishment of the organization's objectives. So a pivotal norm refers to an unwritten rule or norm of behavior within an organization that also allows the organization to actually get to its objectives or outputs. So these are norms of how you do business. These are norms of how you interact with other agents within the organization. These are norms of how you actually behave in your job. And again, some of them may not be directly written out. Some of them may. But they are the norms that actually allow. So when we're talking about a pivotal norm, we're really talking about things that we need to actually maybe quantify or become more structured and write out in order to change them. So recognizing our change is actually, what is it targeting? Well, if it's targeting pivotal norms, that means that these are accepted behaviors that aren't necessarily structurally constructed or written out, but may still be negatively impacting the organization. Peripheral norms are any of the actual more cultural norms. They support and contribute pivotal norms, but they're not essential. So, how people actually interact socially when they're on their break would be a peripheral norm. It will have some impact on the organization and the culture and how people feel, but changing that norm or expecting that norm to change is not going to have a direct impact on the organization's actual objectives. And again, the reason we want to categorize these, all of these are ways to basically, they're models to help us kind of think about an organization as understandable units that can be impacted. I often think about it as, where are the stress points that I can apply a crowbar, and that crowbar is an intervention to change something in a positive way. So what is it that I need to change? So if we're changing an organizational culture, what we're changing is norms. And one of the things I want to think about is which norms are pivotal and which ones are peripheral, and which are the norms that are key to me trying to change if I'm wanting to change how that organization functions. So generally, I'm probably going to be mainly focused on pivotal norms, but those peripheral norms, like attitudes towards change, may also need to be addressed. So also, norms are actually usually taught through a socialization process, both formal and informal. And that socialization process is usually a process that adapts employees to the new culture and makes employees aware of the norms. It's basically how employees encounter culture in an organization. And it's also how people start to understand the power, status, rewards, and sanctions of an organization. So generally speaking, when someone enters an organization, they will have their preconceptions or expectations of what they're going to experience in that organization. So whenever you take on a new job, you have all the information that you've gathered prior to taking that job about the company, about the other types of people that have that job. If you had the job at another company, you're going to have your expectations of how that job was done at that company. If it's moving into a new role, you may have TV shows that illustrated people in that role. Anyway, you've got all that information. Those are your expectations. You then hit the reality. You encounter the culture. What does this job actually look like in this company? And any job is going to have slight tweaks, slight differences from one organization to another, even if it's a highly defined role. The person is then going to have to go through an adjustment to those climates and norms, and they're going to receive feedback, both positive and negative, about what behaviors are acceptable and are less acceptable. And it's kind of almost like a Pavlovian dog way of looking at the world, is that you get rewarded with positive feedback. In other words, hey, way to go, nice shirt, doing well. Those are telling you these behaviors I should keep doing and do more. Or, you wore that to work? That little phrase is telling us, okay, I've probably made a bit of an error. This isn't an acceptable shirt to wear to work. So recognizing that this process is occurring naturally, one of the ways that we can change an organization's culture is to actually create interventions where we make this more structured, where we actually do onboarding, where we let people know, here's the cultural norms, here's the expectations, but also maybe changing what those norms and expectations are to something that's more conducive to additional organizational development. So again, when people are adjusting to cultural norms, we basically have three things that can actually happen. We can have rebellion, conformity, or creative individualism. So basically, these are kind of the three reactions, broadly speaking, that people have to either learning a new norm when they're coming into an organization, or being presented with a new norm as a part of an organizational developmental program or intervention. So obviously, rebellion is rejection of all values and norms. So basically, someone that decides, you know what, these norms are not in my job description. My job description is to do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm not paying attention to any of this other stuff. There's full conformity, acceptance of all values and norms. It's like, okay, I'm going to make sure that I'm making absolutely no waves, and I don't want to stick out in any way. I want to do everything that's expected of me, both officially and unofficially. And most people fall somewhere in the spectrum between those two. Acceptance of pivotal values, maybe rejection of some. So I tend to dress similarly to what I'm expected at work, but I also have a tendency to try to be a little individualistic in how I dress. For example, I kind of grew up in the South. I often refer to myself as a good old Southern boy in an academic body. I like cowboy boots, so I'll often be dressed fairly business professional when I'm at school and I'm teaching classes. But my little rebellion, my creative individualism, is I am the only faculty member in my knowledge that actually typically wears cowboy boots to lectures. Now, if I'm actually going into an organization as an external consultant, I'm probably not going to be wearing cowboy boots and Dockers. I'm probably going to be in a business suit because, again, I recognize that is becoming a little bit more of a pivotal norm, especially when an organization is paying you to come in as an external consultant. So again, just kind of recognizing the spectrum and looking for, you're not necessarily wanting full conformity, but you do want to think about if you're changing norms, you're wanting to try to reduce the likelihood of people rebelling against those norms. And that brings us back to that idea of psychological construct, or contract that we talked about in the first module. An unwritten agreement between individuals in an organization that include norms, but also are including the expectations of the employee of how their job is going to progress and what their career is going to look like in the organization. These are open-ended, so issues may be renegotiated, and I think that's the main thing I really want to stress, is that if we're changing an organization's structure, whether it's how people report within that organization, whether it's moving them to a team-based organization, whether it's changing the values and norms of what people are expected to actually kind of believe and feel about their jobs, all of these are changes to the expectations employees had prior to that intervention of what their job looks like in this organization. And it doesn't mean that a psychological contract can't be changed, but what we want to avoid is the idea that we're just breaking these contracts. So they are open-ended, they can be renegotiated, but that means that we also need to manage the change. We need to have open communication. We need to communicate to the people who are actually having their jobs disrupted and their psychological contracts changed on them, to be a part of the discussion of why this change is occurring and to basically renegotiate that psychological contract with them. So we're going to end up this module looking at Levin's models of organizational change. So Levin's initial model is a good example of kind of a static change to an individual problem that is kind of in the gray zone of, is this actually organizational development, or is this more representing kind of a standard find the problem, fix the problem, go back to normal model? And I would say that Levin's change model is more of an example of a single individual intervention in an organization. So remember, organizational development usually is a program of interventions. So this is a good way to think about each individual intervention. So it's basically looking at change as a matter of modifying forces that act to keep things stable. So the first thing Levin suggested was that there's actually a fair amount of energy in any organization that's focused through both rules, bureaucracy, structure, and culture and norms, is focused on keeping things the same. Which means to make a change, the first thing you have to do is you have to unfreeze the organization. You have to actually directly counter those forces that are there trying to maintain the status quo. Once you've unfrozen the organization, in other words, once you've taken the step of basically creating an environment that allows change, the next is the actual change itself, moving. Real organizational change begins to happen resulting from the intervention. So you've gotten the organization to where it accepts, okay, this change is happening. And ideally, you want that to be driven from the top down, but implemented from the bottom up. In other words, the organization's leadership recognizes a need for change, but your intervention started by convincing everyone in the organization of why the change is good and how it's going to make their jobs better. In other words, you've renegotiated the psychological construct as a way of unfreezing that organization and making it available to change. You're now implementing the new change, the intervention. Once the intervention is complete, you want to refreeze. So the changes, and this is more of a process that will happen naturally. Again, the assumption is that an organization naturally resists change. So once you've successfully moved a structure in the organization, moved a new process, a new procedure, once it's implemented and is being consistently implemented, you can stop applying force, and naturally the organization is going to refreeze and again become resistant to further change. So another way to look at this model is the unfreezing is the recognition of a need for change and a measurement of what the status quo currently is. The moving is the actual implementation of a specific intervention within that organization that is meant to change an outcome. And the refreezing is the successful acknowledgement the intervention is taken, people are now doing it the new way, and now looking to see, did that actually cause the change that was hoped for? So Levin actually recognized, though, that this model, though a very good example and a way to think about individual interventions, was not necessarily capturing the reality of a dynamic organization from an open systems framework, which means that he then created the action research model. The major characteristic of this is it incorporates components of his first model, but now brings it into a cyclic kind of continuous improvement project. So initial research about organization is the foundation, which in turn provides information that can be used to guide further action. So the idea here is that every time that you're measuring your organizational outcomes, you're always looking for what's the next way that we can improve. And it's the idea that research then informs practice, and practice is the practice of organizational development. So comparing the two, we have Levin's change model, we have status, or status quo, we have the intervention, making sure it takes, and then letting it naturally refreeze back to a new status quo. The action research model is more of the unfreezing process is the recognition of a problem, perception, and identification, which then results to the two phases of consultation with an OD expert, either internal or external, and then data gathering to create a diagnosis. Where is the problem? Once the problem is found, we then create feedback to the organizational client. So basically, we measure, we do surveys, we talk to people, we make sure we've gathered information. We diagnose the problem, we create a planning and action steps. In other words, we create an intervention, and then we take that action that takes us back to then data gathering. Did the action work? If it did, the feedback there may be, okay, we can actually stay static at the moment, but we want to keep looking for any indication that change is needed again. So think of it as kind of like a constantly scanning searchlight that is rotating the organization going, is change needed? Is change needed? And when the answer to that question is yes, it starts the cycle of, okay, then we talk about the diagnosis of the problem through gathering of data, so open communication, surveys, letting people have a voice, letting them buy in, creating an intervention, and then taking action, but again, gathering data to see if the intervention was successful. And this problem then continues in the cycle moving forward.